In our previous uh, lessons, we were talking about things moving in one dimension. And we were talking about, though, two things moving. And so we talked about, maybe one thing moving in X and then one thing moving in Y. What we want to do now is talk about things moving in two directions at once. One thing. One thing can move here, so it's actually changing in X and it's changing in Y. And so, in this kind of discussion, in which you're talking about things moving here in two dimensions or in three dimensions, because it could also change in Z, you in or out of the screen, then this multi-dimensional motion, you need to keep track of more thing at once, and more than one thing at a time. And so that is where we introduce the idea of something called a vector. Okay. And a vector is something that will keep track of more than one thing at a time. And that's different than a scalar. A scalar, for example, would be something that just keeps track of one thing. So an example of the difference here. Okay, the example would be a scalar, 6 feet. Okay. A vector, 6 feet up. Okay. Difference of scalar might be 2.5 miles. And on the other side, and a vector, okay, could be 2.5 miles north. That'd be an example vector. Or you might have a torque. Okay, so an example of a torque is 14 foot-pounds. Well, a vector would be 14 foot-pounds clockwise. So you have a direction to it. And so this is what's different between a scalar and a vector. And so handling scalars and vectors, scalars you know how to do. That's what you've been doing, all of your mathematical career. So there's next thing we're going to do is talk about vectors, because now we're having direction associated with this. And so in talking about vectors, we need to include direction. And so that changes our basic way that we talk about these things. And there's a whole area of mathematics, vector algebra or vector calculus, in which you talk about this. And you'll see a lot of vectors in calculus 3. If you have not had if you had calculus 3 already, fantastic. What we're going to talk about here in chapter 3 physics is going to be pretty much boring and a repeat. If you've not had calculus 3, then we'll teach you what you need to know here in chapter 3 of this class. And then when you get to cal 3, then it'll go, oh wait, I know what that is. I've already had an introduction to that. And then you go into more detail. So that's kind of the plan here, is vectors. And before we do go actually directly into vectors, an interesting thing, I found another YouTube video, not one that I made, but someone else with a bit bigger budget and more time made up a vector here, and I'd like you to watch that, and then we'll come back and talk about vectors.